Welcome to CIBER Focus, your source for international business information. I'm your host, Christopher Rice, and our guest today is Dr. Sergio Lemus. Dr. Lemus is an anthropologist whose research interests include theories of race, cultural materiality, the body, Mexican migration, border analysis, and class relations. He earned his PhD in anthropology in 2015 and is currently a visiting assistant professor in the Latino Studies Program at Indiana University. Dr. Lemus focuses on examining class, labor, and political economy of Mexican immigrants to the United States. He's currently engaged on a book titled Los Yarderos, Mexican Yard Workers in Neoliberal Chicago. Today, Dr. Lemus will discuss his research on labor and identity among Mexican entrepreneurs and gardeners in Chicago. Sergio, thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Sergio, to begin, would you tell us more about your background? What drew you to research about Mexican gardeners or Yarderos in Chicago?
So at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, I graduated with a degree in Latin American Studies. So I was very interested in foreign policy. And I set out to study Afro-descendant populations in Mexico, kind of those populations that have been in Mexico from the period of slavery, but they continue to be part of the nation state. But then when I was at the University of California, Riverside, where I sort of set out to study my PhD degree in anthropology, the 2005 and 2006 immigration marches took place in the U.S. If you know, those marches kind of took place throughout the United States, Chicago, Los Angeles, New York, and it was kind of a call from immigration undocumented folks wanting to sort of have a immigration reform to adjust the status. So I thought that then studying this population was sort of, in a way, what I wanted to go ahead and study. So I came back to the University of Illinois to continue my PhD training, looking at the Mexican gardeners in Chicago, studying working class populations.
Okay. What drew you specifically to that population?
In many ways was a personal connection. Being a migrant myself from Mexico, an immigrant myself, since I was very little, growing up in Chicago, I will see them in the streets, kind of going around mowing the lawn of people. Most of the neighborhoods in South Chicago where I grew up. So it was in many ways a personal connection to this population as well.
Great. Well, Sergio, what would you say are the biggest challenges among this population, Mexican immigrant communities in labor? And how has the experience of Los Yarderos changed since the late 1970s?
So two great questions. I think two of the biggest challenges, one is kind of just basic better working conditions for this working class population. How the structure of the gardening service in Chicago is organized in such a way that oftentimes workers start very early in the morning, around 7:30, 8 in the morning, and then work for 10 hours, 11 hours, even sometimes 12 hours in the summer, because they need to sort of work hard in order to make ends meet and also find the income that they need. So many times that, of course, they're not the typical worker that has breaks or have certain period for lunch. They're sort of continue working throughout the day. So oftentimes they only receive about, let's say, 15 minutes of break.
Throughout a whole day?
Throughout the whole day. So there are some of the challenges that they encounter, but it's also how the Yardero economy is organized in many ways. And the other issue is health. While carrying out my field, I found many workers experiencing health issues in relation to arthritis, of having worked for many years in the labor economy. And now we're finding that much of South Chicago and the South Chicago East Side Chicago, which are kind of two working class neighborhoods where I carry out most of my fieldwork. There's the EPA is kind of going and finding quite a bit of pollution in the ground. So now you're finding sort of families where kids are not able to sort of go back to play in the backyards because of the lead or magnesium that is on the ground. So health and sort of very working conditions. How the labor has changed. In many ways, it continues to be a labor-intensive profession. At the level of the equipment, there has been sort of technology advance area, but sort of it's still there is a very kind of hard job to do.
Yeah. Okay, great. Can you talk to us more broadly, I guess, about the role labor plays in society in terms of transformation and assimilation among immigrants?
Sure. So it's very central. I mean, the way they see it is very central. I mean, if you think about it, for many of these Mexican Yarderos, the typical Mexican Yardero earns around $13,000 a year. Usually the company owner, which often is also a Mexican, he of course earns quite a bit more. But oftentimes having better working conditions and having a little bit of extra income is the difference between sort of sending your kids to college or just having the opportunity to even sort of buy a home or engage in other activities around society. So a lot of times most of these workers are very much concentrated on working and very little time is left out for...
So they're very isolated within this community?
In relation to the general U.S. society, yes, but they still find, of course, usually on Sundays, they still find spaces to hang out and sort of socialize. But still, is some of the challenges there.
All right. In your work, you discuss the concept of Transborder Mexico. Could you elaborate on what this term means and the impact it has on identity?
Sure. So it is. It's a very interesting concept that I'm mobilizing. There's other scholars that are mobilizing the concept around, but essentially it emerges from the 1990s. One of the issues with immigration that occurred in the 1990s, there was a scope of immigration, part of it as a consequence of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. And then that led to essentially finding Latina, Hispanic communities in places that were not located in the past, let's say North Carolina, Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia. So there was a need to understand how these migrants found and developed their connections back to Mexico. A lot of folks use the term transnationalism to explain the relations between the two nation states. And where I'm coming from in my work is to suggest that these experiences actually could be labeled as transborder because it's not just the U.S.-Mexico border that is relevant, although it is for the way they organize and structure their lives, but it is multiple borders that are beyond the U.S.-Mexico border. And a lot of these are about sort of power relations. A lot of these are about internal borders within families, internal borders within communities, internal borders within neighborhoods. And it is beyond just a transnational experience. It is one way to think about it is transborder experiences, and Transborder Mexico is a subset of transnational processes.
Okay. And so it's every kind of border, kind of.
It's every kind of border. How I use Transborder Mexico is to more specifically to talk about borders that are even present among communities even before the creation of the Mexican nation state or the U.S. nation state. So using a transborder framework help us to think about, for instance, how colonial ideas about identity or skin color differentiation, you still find those relevant categories in present-day populations. Then how to make sense of those, I go back to the concept of Transborder Mexico to sort of, in a very kind of ethnographic, anthropological way, think about how they are thinking about their identity in the context of the United States, having crossed a very sort of stiff international border, but then encountering borders as they progress to the other spaces of the nation state. So it's trying to map out how this process operates.
Okay. Well, very interesting. How supportive do you find local communities toward Mexican immigrant entrepreneurs, and what kinds of resources do immigrants need to start their own businesses?
So it varies. Overall, there's very few resources to Mexican immigrants. Oftentimes, there are kind of channel within kind of our community centers, like in South Chicago, where I carry out my research. There was one community center that had different programs developed, but many of those programs are not necessarily geared towards developing these entrepreneur qualities of individuals. Part of it has to do because you develop yourself as an entrepreneur by actually carrying out the work.
Right.
So then you develop kind of a hierarchy of you start at the lowest level and then work your way up to become essentially the owner of the motor production within sort of the Yardero hierarchy of labor.
That's a lengthy process.
It is. For the folks that I talk to, it usually takes them 1 year. From 1 year, if they have a good support system by family members, so oftentimes it takes them even 4 or 5 years to even reach a level where they can become self-employed individuals in this industry. And as far as the following question of the support, again, is very little to some degree, but there's a few spaces where folks can go and find out, let's say, how to develop a business model, how to market their business. But again, a lot of it is just go ahead and do the work.
And some networking as well.
Correct, and networking. Yeah. I think networking is probably one of the most essential characteristics of being a successful Yardero or not, making it.
Great. Sergio, thanks a lot for coming in.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
That's all for this edition of CIBER Focus. Thank you for tuning in. If you have any comments or suggestions for future topics, please let us know at CIBER, that's CIBER, CIBER, @indiana.edu.